What is the proper role for NATO in this new world that we face?
Well, I think NATO still has a role as a pillar of the European security architecture. I guess where I differ from General Allen is that I don't see the need to expand NATO, particularly in the period in which the Cold War, which had been the primary rationale for NATO, was over. Secondly, I have no problem with the United States continuing commitment to our NATO allies, but I just don't think that we need to do that with forward deployed U.S. forces. And I think we also need to be mindful of the fact that all along a big problem with NATO, and this goes way back to the Cold War, has been the problem of burden sharing. And a big element of that is the fact that the Europeans could always count on the United States no matter what level of contribution that they made. I don't think it's unfair in the current environment, and I don't think it's a threat to NATO's security to say, hey, the world has changed. We no longer live in the world of the Fulda Gap and the Warsaw Pact. It's time to rethink what our relationship is, not breaking it, but asking the hard questions about whether if the Europeans really feel this sense of threat, why aren't they meeting their NATO targets for defense spending?
General Allen, you had a two-finger.
Yeah, look, NATO is in fact going to start to meet those defense levels, the 2% and then 20% for modernization, and they're well on their way to doing that. And if we don't think that Russia has been acting as though it is a military threat to the eastern flank of NATO, Zapad 2017, their major exercise this year, may have had as many as 250,000 troops involved in it. Along the NATO border, why would that be necessary if they weren't attempting to intimidate the NATO states on the eastern flank? Their strategic influence operation has done a great deal to destabilize both the EU and NATO, and arguably, while NATO is a defensive alliance and isn't against anyone, it's about the defense of Western Europe, the EU as a bloc of liberal democracies that stand for human rights and economic progress, the EU is a real threat to Russia in the sense that as long as they remain a constant bloc, they are a counter influence to Russia. And it's much easier for Putin to deal with the European states in a series of bilateral relationships than ultimately as a bloc. But what NATO is attempting to do now, of course, is to work as an entity to deter Russia to the east, but also, very importantly, NATO is working to project stability into the Middle East and in North Africa. And this is long overdue. A couple more waves of several million migrants into Europe, and we're going to see Europe fundamentally change forever. And NATO's intent to try to work with countries in the Middle East and in North Africa to try to stabilize those countries so that the populations will remain home, that's an important contribution of NATO in the future.